is there room for game theory in the Austrian economics paradigm? As you know, probably many Austrian economists have argued that they care little for game theory for a variety of reasons. First, game theory is highly mathematical, and as you know, Austrian economists tend to think that mathematics is not the best way to analyze complex economic processes. Game theory rests on a conception of rationality, namely instrumental rationality, that is essentially constructivist. And game theory models aim at identifying an equilibrium, the famous Nash equilibrium, of course, whereas Austrians are more concerned with market processes, which are said to be often verging on disequilibrium. And finally, game theorists claim to be able to predict the outcome of specific strategic choices, whereas Hayek tend to prefer to think that only pattern predictions are possible as opposed to specific point predictions. So for these reasons and others, game theory doesn't have a very good image among Austrian economists. So the arguments I want to put forward in my paper and will summarize here is as follows. First, it is ironic that actually at various points, game theory and Austrian economics crossed paths. But opportunities for cross-fertilizations were missed. In more recent years, however, game theory has evolved very dramatically away from its origins, from classical game theory, in directions that curiously overlap to a very considerable extent with the concerns and ideas of Austrian economics. How have or should Austrians respond to this challenge? There is no unanimity in this respect. There are at least three positions. One is to continue to emphasize the difference, no trucker trade with game theory. Another is, oh great, now we're moving forward in the same direction, let's embrace each other. And the third position is, well, there still are differences, but maybe in some instances, game theory can be useful to us. So that's at the theoretical level, but my main point, I hope I'll have time to get to that, my main point is actually that yes, there are still differences at the theoretical level, but Austrian economists might want to look at game theory from another standpoint, which is the public policy perspective. From a public policy perspective, how do we get to an economy, a set of social institutional arrangements where the ideas of game theory are put in place, the implementation process, if you want. From that perspective, game theory is absolutely indispensable, I would argue. You cannot discuss public policy issues without engaging with game theory. It's not necessarily the only perspective, but it's one that the game theory, that Austrian economists cannot afford to ignore. Maybe I'll skip over some of these things. As I said in my introduction, at various points, game theory and Austrian economics cross paths. It's interesting that Oskar Morgenstern, the co-author with von Neumann of the famous theory of games and economic behavior, which is considered to be the origin of game theory, was educated in Austria and learned his economics from various Austrian economists, in particular from Hans Meyer. And he was very critical of the neoclassical Walrasian notion of equilibrium theory, and he was also very critical of the mathematical approach to economics of his time. However, a little bit like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Morgenstern had another side to his intellectual interests, and that was that he was very impressed by Carl Menger's ideas about logic and mathematics. I'm talking about Carl with a K here, which was Carl Menger's son, who was a mathematician and had different ideas from his father. And Morgenstern came to share Menger's view that ethics and the social sciences must rest on an axiomatic deductive basis. So that's why, here is Morgenstern, that's why he, when he met von Neumann in the US, they had a common interest and wrote the Theory of Games and Economic Behavior. It's not a work of Austrian economics, but nevertheless there are interesting aspects which differentiates the theory of games from neoclassical economics. First, for Morgenstern, the notion of economics applies only to micro situations, relationship between a few agents and not necessarily to the whole economy. And secondly, the mathematics they use, i.e. of course sets theory, is far more abstract and more comparable to pure logic than conventional calculus. But let's leave that aside. After when game theory finally, for reasons we explain in the paper, I don't have time to explain here, it took until the 1980s, practically, late 70s, for game theory to become very central to economics. But over the last 2 decades or so, game theory has and economics have moved far away from the original classical models of, in particular, I skipped over Nash in the interest of time, but of course, one footnote about Nash. He only took one economics course in his life, but it was taught by an Austrian, Bert Hosselitz. But no, to come back to the present, game theory has evolved dramatically in at least 3 respects. First, it has become a tool used extensively in behavioral economic research. Typically, the subject of experiments in experimental economics play games, and we test the experimenters test the effects of different sorts of priming to see how subject responds to different frames of reference. Hence the significance of bounded rationality, and you cannot accuse now game theorists of being wedded to the Homo economicus notion of instrumental rationality. They've moved toward bounded rationality. Secondly, evolutionary game theory, which originated in biology, has found strong advocates among economists, and here we're almost totally abandoned, like such as Herbert Gentis, and here we totally abandon rationality because there's not much rationality, at least in the human sense, among genes and phenotypes. And thirdly, so-called epistemic game theory has taken a more in-depth and critical look at some of the unexamined assumptions of classical game theory. So there is now a branch of game theory which is about the games that people play before they get to the very basic assumption that classical game theory assumed were true, right? Such as common knowledge. So epistemic game theory is, well, maybe common knowledge is not something that is rational for all. Okay. All right. So. I said von Neumann and Morgenstern, then the Nash, that's the zero-sum games, Nash equilibrium, non-zero-sum games, evolutionary game theory, behavioral game theory, and epistemic game theory. How much time do you have? 5 minutes, okay. So, so as I said, these trends are pushing game theory closer to the Austrian paradigms, with bounded rationality instead of strict rationality. Evolutionary game theory rediscovers on its own the very concept of spontaneous order. For example, look at works by Robert Sugden. And epistemic game theory reinforces Austrian skepticism about the possibility of making predictions about how economic agents behave in specific situations. So, do we have conversions here? As I said earlier, some people say yes. Nikolai Faust, for example, say let's embrace each other. Some authors, such as Butker or Nikolai Kanaki, underline the difference between the Hayekian conception of knowledge and the game theorists. So there is no conversions because there are still some fundamental differences about the notion of knowledge. And some authors, such as the French economist Loïc Sauce, argues that it depends on the situation. In situations where transaction costs are low, then Austrian economics applies. But in situations where transaction costs are high, maybe game theory is a more relevant model. Refer you to the literature. I have to move on. Okay, so, but as I said, I think game theory is indispensable if we want to move toward what Mark Pennington calls a robust political economy, and a political economy which is more market-oriented. How do we move from here to there? And for that, in that respect, game theory is important, at least in two respects. First, to evaluate whether there are feasible institutional arrangements in which Austrian economics recommendation would best be applied. So is there a feasible world out there we want to get to, or maybe it's hopelessly utopian in the first place. And secondly, assuming that it's not hopelessly utopian, how do we get there? So in the interest of time, I have to quickly summarize this, but I would say that in order to find a feasible set of institutional arrangements ranging from total anarchy to a substantial state, okay, the game theory is very useful, in particular the prisoner's dilemma game, because an anarchic situation, for example, runs against the problem of the prisoner's dilemma. And there is a whole literature on this. I'm not trying to say that anarchy is totally impossible, but it looks pretty much impossible. And in fact, the point argued rather convincingly, at least as far as I'm concerned, by Tulloch, Buchanan, and others. So let's assume, such as Mark Pennington, that we cannot have total anarchy, but we can have a sort of a relatively modest, if not minimal, at least modest state, because this is probably the only way to solve prisoner's dilemma. But the more tractable question is, how are citizens of more or less liberal democracies to get to the endpoint of this more robust, market-oriented political economy? So, metaphorically, I stress, because it's the question of rewriting the social contract. And fortunately, because I'm running out of time, I can refer you, which I do to the paper, to the monumental work produced by Ken Binmore on this. Two enormous volumes plus a summary called Natural Justice, and he still continues to write on this. Very briefly, I'll summarize some of the things he said. The essential point he makes, and which I want to make too, is that on the one hand, yes, we want a more efficient system, and for that we want less intervention, more market. However, there is another dimension which is a product of evolution, which is fairness. You cannot force people to move entirely forcefully in the direction of a robust economy if people think that it is not fair. So the games that have to be played are games in which, on the one hand, you reform institutions in a way that is more market-friendly, but you also have to take into account the expectation of fairness of the general public, which is not trained in Austrian economics, right? And so there are games to be played here, and what Binmore recommends is that these games are better played, and Austrians will like that, at the local level in a decentralized manner, maybe run pilot experiments, for example, but you cannot tell the people it's good for them to move toward a market-oriented economy. You have to play various games. These games are better played at the local level, start small, in a sense, the Binmore is rediscovering Tocqueville. You know, the local democracy is where things are at. Try small, start small as cities or province or state level and see how it goes from there. I'm probably out of time, but the paper also referred to the work of the Bloomington School, Eleanor Ostrom, which also showed that the small scale level, all kinds of things can be done which cannot be done at the central level. So my conclusion is that the games to be played are better played at the decentralized level, small level, if we want to move forward toward a robust political economy. But I refer you to Binmore for a little more elaboration on this, since I've run out of time.